Okay, now let's do cluster detection. Okay, so you have some data. Maybe it's just two-dimensional data. You have an x variable and a y variable, so you have data in the plane, for example. And you're trying to set we immediately recognize that this data falls into groups, right? So with our eyes and brains, we can easily and quickly see that the data falls into clusters. However, there are two questions here. First of all, how can a computer see these? How does it know when to say this is a cluster and when to say when it's not a cluster? And also, what if we have many dimensions, many variables, not just two? For example, suppose we have 10 variables. So here I just said we have just two. Then how can we see the clusters? So we can't even visualize 10 variables, but still the data could fall into clusters. What do I mean by saying that the data falls into clusters? I mean that there are groups of objects that are similar to each other. Like all of these are supposedly quite similar to each other. Okay, so even if we had more variables, doesn't mean that things couldn't be similar to each other. Consider Docomo. Everybody knows the Japanese phone company. They have many customers. Maybe they have 30 million customers. So if we could break down these customers into groups that were similar, it may make it easier to understand their customers, right? If they could break them down into groups that were similar. It may make it easier for them to market to their customers as well. So if they have one group, maybe they know that these people like kind of flashy phones, so they won't send them like Jimmy phones. They won't send them like phones that are boring, or that are not boring but that aren't flashy. They'll send them information about phones that are flashy. So it may make it easier for them to market to their customers. All right, now I'm going to give you an example of an algorithm. I thought that we might have saved this till later when we were actually doing the algorithms, but this is so clear that I thought I would give it to you here. So I'm going to talk about something called the k-means clustering algorithm. Suppose we have data about our customers. Suppose, however, for this example that we have only two variables in our study, x and y. So let's say that x is the number of times a person visits our website per month. And let's say that y is the number of purchases that they make per month from our site. And suppose we want to group our customers. Let's look at an approach to this. Okay, so here we have two axes, the y-axis and the x-axis. I said let's pretend that x is the number of visits and y is the number of purchases. So over here, this person has kind of a large number of visits compared to this person. This person has kind of a large number of visits, but the number of purchases maybe is not so high. Whereas this person has a large number of visits and kind of a lot of purchases. On the other hand, this person has kind of not many visits but a lot of purchases. So we like this person, right? Because every time they come to the store, they purchase a lot. Okay? So let's suppose we have that situation. This is called unsupervised learning, and we're looking to find natural groupings of instances given unlabeled data. So unlabeled means we don't have sort of a class variable. So we just have, for example, just x and y. We don't have a class variable. Now note that this, I keep using business examples, but this really doesn't have to be focused on business at all. Clustering is used in many areas. For example, clustering cells according to the expressed DNA in the cell. And this may help in understanding cancerous cells, for example. And this is used for that purpose. All right, but anyway, let's go back to this example. So we might say, oh, here's a group here, and another group here, and the third group there. So maybe we can identify 3 groups here. And here's how this k-means algorithm would do that. How a computer could do that. How a computer could find groups. Now if you look at this data, maybe we could say there are some groups here, and here, and here. Okay? So how can we have a computer find these groups? So let's see how the algorithm works. So the algorithm starts by you pick 3 initial cluster centers randomly. So you just pick any 3 points, any 3 dots, not necessarily these dots here, just any 3 points in the plane. And 3 is arbitrary. In other words, we're going to search for 3 clusters. If you wanted to search for 4, 5, 6, or 7, you could choose 4, 5, 6, or 7 arbitrary points in the plane. Okay, so these points are just going to be arbitrary. They're not going to be this point. They're not going to have to be the blue dots or anything like that. Just any 3 points in the plane, and you pick them randomly. So that sounds strange, but that's the way this algorithm starts. So suppose we pick this point, and this point. K1, K2, K3. All right, now what do we do? Okay. Now what we do is we say, okay, this is the center of our first cluster. This is the center of our second cluster. This is the center of our third cluster. If that's true, then which points should belong to this cluster? Well, the ones that are closest. Remember, we kept talking about closest. Now, here, closest just means the actual distance. If we were talking about colors, then we said that there's not really any meaning, or not a clear meaning, to closest. But here, if we're just talking about points in the plane, then we can talk about the physical distance. So which points are closest to K1? Those will be in one group. Which points are closest to K2? Those will be in another group. So like this one, should this be in cluster 1, cluster 2, or cluster 3? Well, clearly it's closest to K2, so it's going to be in cluster 2. Whereas this point, should this be in K1, K2, or K3, that is cluster 1, cluster 2, or cluster 3, well, clearly it's closer to here, so it should be in cluster 3. So we get this. So we get these points are all in a group closest to this so-called center. It's obviously not the center. These points are closest to this, so it's close, so they're in one group. And these points are all closest to this, so they're all in one group. So assign each point to the closest cluster center. All right, now what should we do? Well, now that we have a group of points, we can calculate the center of that group. So instead of saying this is the center, we can actually calculate the real center, right? So we calculate the center of all these points, and the center of all these points, and the center of all these points. So we get like this is the center of the red ones, this is the center of the green ones, and this is the center of the blue ones. So move each cluster center to the mean of each cluster. And we're using the mean. Okay. Move each cluster center to the mean of each cluster like that. So we get this. Okay, now what do we do? Now we have a new center. So maybe, before this point was closest to wherever K1 was, but maybe now it's not closest to K1, maybe it's closer to K2. And that may be true of other points as well. So some of the points now will be reassigned. And this is all easily done, obviously, with the computer. So which points are reassigned? So maybe this one. The 3 points with the animation, let's see. This one, and this one, and this one have been reassigned. So this one was reassigned to here. Okay? Now what do we do next? What do you think we do next? Well, now that this point has been added to this cluster, we're going to have a new center if we calculate the center. So we're going to move this to its new center, move this to its new center, move this to its new center. So recompute the cluster means and move cluster centers to the cluster means. Okay? And now what do? Now we check to see if there are any new points that have switched clusters, and just keep doing this until finally, hopefully, no points are switching anymore, and then we stop. And then we have clustered the data into groups that are similar. So I'm not going to go through this. You can read this. You can stop this and read this. You can look at that. This says that instead of using the mean, you can calculate the median for each of the clusters to get a different kind of so-called center. So you can stop this and read this. You can read that. And so on. Okay. Now you can read that also. Alright, cluster detection. A group of data objects among which there exists some degree of similarity. So that's what we mean by a cluster. The data objects within a cluster are known as members of the cluster. It is expected that similarity among members of a cluster should be high, and similarity among objects of different clusters should be low. The objectives of clustering include 1. Knowing which data objects belong to which cluster, and 2. Understanding the common characteristics of the members of a specific cluster. So why are these particular people grouped into a cluster? What makes them similar? So that's a very interesting part of clustering. There is some similarity between clustering and classification. Remember, in the last video we talked about classification. They're not the same thing. Clustering and classification are not the same thing. The most important difference is that clustering, we're not trying to predict anything. We don't have a variable like a class variable that we're trying to predict. We're not trying to predict whether something is a good loan or a bad loan candidate, or whether it's a iris setosa, iris virginica, or whatever. We don't have a class variable. We say that the data is not labeled. The label usually refers to the class variable. So we would say there is no class variable, so there's no label. Anyway, there is some similarity between clustering and classification. Both classification and clustering are about assigning appropriate class or cluster labels to data records. Actually, I don't really agree with that. However, clustering differs from classification in 2 aspects. First, in clustering there is no predefined classes. This means that the number of classes or clusters and the class or cluster label of each data record are not known before the operation. Second, clustering is about grouping data rather than developing a classification model. Therefore, there is no distinction between data records and okay, anyway, you can read this. Actually, I don't agree with much of it. But one thing we do want to do when we cluster is we want to take each record. That means each in that k-means algorithm thing, each dot is a record, or each person is a record, or whatever. We want to take each record and assign it to a cluster. We want to know, going back to those pictures, this dot, which cluster does it belong to? So we'll say it belongs to cluster 2. This dot, so for each record we want to know where to which cluster it belongs. So that's what this shows. It says record A belongs to cluster 1, record B belongs to cluster 2, record C belongs to cluster 1, record D belongs to cluster 1, record E belongs to cluster 3, and so on. However, there's another approach to clustering. I think it might be called fuzzy clustering, where we say, okay, record A is primarily in cluster 1, but it has some aspects of cluster 2 and cluster 3. So, point 6 is bigger than point 1 and point 3, so it's primarily a member of cluster 1. So you could have that kind of clustering. which I think is called fuzzy clustering. Okay, so the figure above shows two ways to represent cluster membership. On the left, each member has a single and exclusive membership. On the right, we see a table that indicates the likelihood of the cluster to which a data object belongs.